Okay, there, that's better. There. So there are copies available if you absolutely insist on having a copy, because we're trying to save the earth. So if you have a smartphone, or if you were smart like Glenn and printed it out in advance, that would be great. But you can follow the link in Friday's newsletter, and you'll be able to see it right at the top of the newsletter. So, and I know some of you haven't had a chance to look at it at all. So I think what I might actually do right now is give you about 3 minutes to just look through it so that you can kind of start absorbing some things. Really? It shouldn't. It should go straight to the website, not to the Google report. All right. Go to firstucolumbus.org and then go to the governance page. And then at the very bottom of that page, it says reports. It should be there. Yes. Yeah, the QR code doesn't work evidently, so go to firstucolumbus.org, then click on the governance page, then go to the bottom and you'll find the report there. Yes?
I have a question. What was the reasoning behind putting it under governance rather than on the first page of the Friday report where it would have been more accessible?
Because we want it to be there for a long time. So,
Both places?
you mean the front page of the website? Or no?
No, I meant the Friday news.
Yeah, we're going to send something else out on Tuesday, so I'll talk to Becca about making it a little bit more accessible. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we just couldn't figure out where on the website it belonged, so, yeah, yeah. And Christine is going to be our wandering microphone. Okay. So a lot of this is repetition from what I've been talking about all year long. So I'll start again with the definition of developmental ministry. It's a kind of transitional ministry, like interim ministry, except that it's focused on very particular goals that were developed with Reverend Sunshine's help, the staff and the board, that we need to address before we can be released from special care status. But those goals will change. The board and leadership will have different goals over time as long as we continue to do some work on those particular goals. So that's what developmental ministry is about, which means that it's not a set term. The term is set by when we feel like we won't ever perfect getting to like I said this morning, we won't ever be in a perfect place, but we will make progress. And so once we feel like we've made the progress we need to make, then that's when the congregation can be released and go into search if you like. So that's why my contract is year to year with an extension to 7. I doubt that it's going to take that, but that's the reason it is set up that way. So questions about developmental ministry, let me ask that first. Anybody? That mostly clear? Where did I go? So the next section I recognize was probably hard for a lot of people to read. And I worked really carefully with the board to make sure that I got it as accurate as I could. There's probably more things to be said. The timeline that is another link inside of that gives you a lot more detail. I don't really feel equipped to handle a lot of questions about that time because I wasn't here. So I can take a few of them. I might have to just say, let's have further conversation about it if you still, yeah, Sylvia, hold on, wait.
Who wrote the timeline and what's the date on it? This is Archives speaking.
Right, so Cindy Wicker and Jim Conlon wrote the timeline, and they were both on the board during that time. So yes, we will add a timeline, add a time onto it.
Add the date and who wrote it, please.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And the board also saw that. Yeah. So needless to say, again, a really painful time, which was exacerbated by the fact that the board felt hamstrung in telling the story to the congregation, which led to a lot of misinformation and a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration and a lot of hurt feelings all around. So would I like to wave a magic wand and have the MFC use a different process? Yes, is the answer to that. But it is what it is at this point. So it feels important that we can put this out there now, given that there's always been so much confusion. So, yeah. Other questions at that? It is being streamed. Yep, streamed on YouTube. Yeah.
Does that mean it'll be
Yes.
on YouTube later?
Yes. Yeah. And if they come up with any questions on there, I hope you can wave your hand and let me know. Do you want to talk a little bit, Sunshine, about the beginning stages of the developmental ministry process? Would that be helpful to folks?
Maybe about this.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. I want to say that your entry into developmental ministry is slightly different than most congregations, in part because you initially entered into an interim search. And around the same time that was happening, I, in my role as field staff, worked with the board and worked with the staff. It was me that created the designation of special care for you. And what that means is you can't enter into settled search until you achieve a certain set of goals. And actually, you don't have to achieve them, but you have to do some work on them. So we're not even saying it needs, there's no such thing as perfection. And the board took that seriously. And so in their search, they found that Reverend Cooley was willing to enter into a developmental ministry with you. Developmental ministry usually involves goals that the board creates with the leaders of the congregation. And since the board and the staff were involved in the creation of the special care goals, those ended up aligning. Here's what I want to say. The board and the staff are not committed to those goals being your developmental ministry goals. You can create some new ones based on who you are, because I got to tell you, even a year later, you all seem so much happier and vibrant, and clearly a lot has changed. You've done some serious work, and it is noticeable. So I think the special care status, given another year or two, we'll easily be able to say you've accomplished enough towards those goals to remove that status. That said, we do recommend developmental ministry take 3 to 7 years to really make sure there's a cultural shift, that you've really internalized, embodied the goals that you set for yourselves. Does that make sense? Does anybody have questions about what I've just said? One back there and one in the front. Back.
Hi, I'm Susan Williams. I'll take this off. I'm Susan Williams.
Susan.
And however long our developmental process takes before we are privileged with the UUA helping us find a new settled minister, what special process is the Office of Settlement going to go through, and the Ministers Association, to deal with the factors in their organizations and their systemic issues that contributed to our issues? Because I think one of the things that Reverend Sylvia and I discovered in taking the deep dive that we did was that even though the ministers have changed their covenant, the culture around previous covenants amongst all the ministers functioned not so much to end the likelihood of any of them triangulating with each other, but it became more of you can gossip amongst yourselves, but you can't out any other minister's bad behavior.
Right.
And the Catholics just, move priests around that are misbehaving. We just keep our secrets quiet and allow our ministers to move around on their own.
Yeah.
And so we're special, but I think the UUA is special in some important ways too. And I don't know that not being allowed to use the UUA's process of settlement is any punishment that I care about anymore.
Yeah. And to be clear, it's not meant to be a punishment. Honestly, it's not. Yeah. Well, and I want to say, your special care, you're not special. I mean, it's sad to say. About 70% of our congregations have experienced some form of ministerial misconduct in their history. 70%. That's pretty 70%, which is actually pretty comparable to other denominations, sad to say. And there are a few pieces of our history that I want to own into. One is that culture has changed in large part to more women joining the ministry, more trans folks joining the ministry. It's not to say that all of the men of the past engaged in bad behavior, but there was definitely a culture of that we've had to do a lot of transformation work on. The UUA has had to engage in a lot of processes, not the least of which is actually having a complaint process, which your previous minister had to go through, and that's fairly new. That process is maybe 10 years old at this point. It is not perfect, I agree, absolutely. And the Ministerial Fellowship Committee is working on that. The UUMA, I think the Ministers Association has some differing understandings in the community itself. And the thing that I have had to repeat as an interim minister who's worked with congregations recovering from misconduct, because I get ministerial colleagues mad at me because I'm talking about things that they've done, is that we're not allowed to rumor and badmouth our colleagues, but our covenant, the very beginning, it says right in our covenant, except when it is for the benefit of a congregation. We are absolutely allowed to talk about the behavior of our colleagues if it is to help a congregation deal and cope, right? And so, in fact, it's almost necessary, because one of the things we know about trauma healing is if people can't engage at least a little bit with the story of what happened, it's nearly impossible to move into a phase of recovery. And so we have to be able to talk about those things. And so I have colleagues who are like, well, you're not allowed to talk about these things that I did. That's against the collegial code. It's not. But there's definitely a community of ministerial colleagues who believe that. And so there's a lot of undoing. We're by no means doing it perfectly. We're doing better than we used to. We've got a long way to go. And what I will say, as I said the very first time I joined you all, is all I can do is apologize on behalf of the UU Association and the UU Ministers Association for the harm we've caused. And please keep holding us accountable. The special care status is meant to say, we want you to be as healthy as you can be so that the folks who we're training to not do some of this crap don't end up in a situation where they're mistrusted. We want to send you somebody who's good and strong. And that means that we've got to do our work and you do too. Yeah? Okay. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it helps. There.
Sue Farnlocker.
Hi, Sue.
When we get out of special care status, does that mean that, I'm assuming Teresa won't go immediately?
No.
She'll give us a chance to get a search committee and get a settled minister, right? So we can keep having more sourdough bread.
I like where your priorities are. That's excellent, yes. And also you can have any transitional minister right now. The other thing you should know is even as we have you on the special care status as a settled ministry, the settled ministry search process is about to change drastically. It's one, supposed to be a little more affordable for you all, but it also is going to remove some steps, maybe not doing full week-long. There's some stuff, right, to try and make it more manageable and healthy for the ministers in search and the congregation. So just know the processes you've been in the past may be very different by the time you enter into it. But we just want to make sure that should you choose to marry a minister, so to speak, that you are ready and they are ready for that. Jan's got a question.
I just want to clarify that just because we could go into search doesn't mean we have to.
Yes.
Reverend Teresa's contract with us can go as long as 7 years. So if we, at the end of 5, were out of the status, we could still, if it were a mutual agreement, Teresa could stay for 7 years. So I just want to make sure that we all heard that so that there's not any kind of imperative that once we're out of special care status, then we have to do whatever. So,
Absolutely. Okay. And really, please do the discernment. Just, don't jump into it because it's the next safe thing, that it's a nice square that's easy to, be blobular for a while. I think that's good. And, when the blob says, okay, maybe it's now time, honestly, our bar hopefully is lower than yours. Yeah? Okay. Any other questions about what I've said so we can get back to Reverend Cooley's report? All right, troublemakers. Also, if you want stickers, I have them. Come find me.
Reverend Sunshine has a sticker ministry, so. So I just want to say thank you to those who served on the board during these last few years. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been a really, really hard time for them. And they deserve our support and our gratitude. So that's a big part of why it's been challenging to move lockstep forward, because it's been hard. It's been really, really hard. So I want to ask you to give your appreciation to the board. And guess what? It's been a hard time for the staff. So the fact that the staff are still here is really wonderful. And we're slowly working our way into a new understanding of how we can be together, exploring collaborative ways of doing things, as well as having some clarity, which is always, like I just said in my sermon, a little bit of a dance that we have to do. So anything about that kind of traumatic experience and things like that, do you want to ask? And I'm not going to put the board members on the spot, so yeah. So you already heard from me this morning about shared leadership. You've probably heard me preach 4 times about it, so I don't know that I need to go into that much more. But I can entertain questions about that if you have any. Yeah, Susan.
I know too much not to get in trouble. So we're looking at collaborative staff models or ways of being, and that's really interesting. The governance process that we went through before this was very much about establishing a form. Reverend Marion kind of gave it a friendlier name of partnership. And recently, Renee Rahutsky put up a personal opinion blog or article in the UUA website about, we sort of jumped into this form of governance because we didn't have any really solid answers out there. Somebody wrote a book, somebody else did a UU University on it. It was the only model that we had. Are there other models coming up? Are the people who are coming into leadership and being nominated for leadership, are they educated about the experiment that we tried? And for me, the most important thing was not like, oh, whoopee, we get to write more policy, this is so sexy. The congregation's really going to love this. It was, the policy was work that needed to be done so that we would get this process of deep listening, of powerful questions, where the congregation, the board's big job was to come up with these deep questions, listen to the congregation, and turn those thoughts and desires into meaningful goals and give that to the staff for the staff to lead. Maybe the staff leading in the way that that policy transition first had in mind isn't going to be what we want. But I miss that it feels like we never, ever got to that point where the board's job was coming up with really deep, meaty questions, which seems to me a lot more fun reason to want to be on the board than to write policy or to have to mediate terrible conflicts. And then have the listening process.
Yeah.
Are we likely to ever get there again? Is that
Well,
part of what the staff is
So one of the things
thinking
I'm
about?
asking for the board to do in our next iteration is to appoint a governance task force that will start the process by having conversations with everybody, all the committees, all the different groups, individuals. Where did governance work for you? Where did governance not work for you? What was your experience of our governance system? Sounds like it was a confusing experience. So that's the first stage of that process. The second stage is then, out of that listening, to come up with some proposals for how things might go in the future. And then, assuming if those proposals and experiments work, the third year can be encoding those things in bylaws and policies and things like that. So listening, experimenting, and coding. Now, I'm assuming that that's going to be some kind of amalgam of things that we had. I think one of the things that I've learned serving now 3 congregations in policy governance that have been experiencing misconduct is that one of the serious flaws of policy governance is it leaves a big hole through which misconducting ministers could drive a Mack truck, because it doesn't hold ministers accountable. It doesn't hold ministers accountable for their day-to-day behaviors. All it does is say, here's our goals, how are we doing on our goals? Which is different from having an accountable minister. So the last thing you're going to hear from me is, let's go back to a pure form of policy governance. Doesn't mean that there weren't important things that we learned about policy governance, asking important questions, all of that. Unfortunately, what developed over time in a lot of congregations was the board spent all the time, reading policy reports or monitoring reports. I had to write those for the UUA. Let me tell you how miserable that is. So there's going to be something, we need to look at both of those systems, all of the systems, to say, what did we learn from it? How can we create something that may be unique to us that hopefully can take some of the good and let go of some of the bad? So Dan Hotchkiss's book, Ministry and Governance, I think is helpful because it names the principles of good governance as opposed to saying this is the governance system you have to use. So I have given that to one of our hopefully new board members, and I'm going to give it to one of our hopefully other new board members to give them a primer on kind of principles of governance. So that's where we're going to start with that process.
Sylvia Howe. Being a member of the archives, that's my hat. There are a lot of reports and archives of things that have been tried, some very successful, some not so successful. I would ask that somebody at least scan them, because it's silly to reinvent what we've already done. They are filed fairly succinctly. They're easily available. They're important documents.
Other questions? Okay. So the rest of this goes through the goals and where I think we are on them. You've seen me do a lot of work on conflict transformation. One of the great suggestions from the covenantal relations team is that I split that out and do small chunks of ongoing workshops, which has been so far very successful for the people that have come, and we're going to continue to do that. So there was a session on deep listening, there was a session on polarity management. Next Tuesday, Tuesday after next, I'm going to do one on the art of powerful questions. So we're going to continue to cycle through those little pieces, because that's a lot easier for people to have access to than my whole big training. So, and my whole big training is not the end-all, be-all word on conflict either. So there's going to be other things that we can hopefully bring in as well. So the covenantal relations team has been a really, really helpful partner. Any of you here today? Yes, Lisa Brandt. It's fantastic. And Lisa has helped us create a new policy. So it's great. So that's a big part of our strategies around conflict, is to just create ongoing opportunities for people to learn. And once you get kind of a rough third of the congregation trained in how to have healthy conversations, then that ends up seeping out into the congregation and developing everybody's skills. So hopefully that will be the case as we go on. We've been working on board and staff relations. The senior staff come to board meetings, and it's still a challenge, in large part due to that trauma. So that's going to be an ongoing job. The minister members, of which we have a number here. Raise your hands. Yes, excellent. I've been working on relationship with the minister members. I hope they think that's been successful. So I think that we're going to be at a place where we can start to create a covenant together. It needed this year of sort of settling before I think we could do that. I think in the beginning of the last ministry, a covenant was put in front of people and it's like, you have to sign this. So that's not how I wanted to do this. So we're working on that. But it's terrific to have all these great ministers a part of all of these groups in the church. Sylvia, she says, is part of archives and helped develop this wonderful report. Susan is on the transition team. Kathleen is integral to the pastoral care team. And we're so glad to have Marco back. It's really terrific. So questions about that piece?
I know that it has to be developed, but what goes into that type of covenant with member ministers?
So part of the challenge of that is to kind of get clear on where our primary allegiance is. And I think that one of the things that we're going to have to negotiate is a recognition that we have allegiance to this congregation and we have allegiance to one another, and make those be in balance with each other. And I can't give you the exact words about that, but yeah. Other questions? Okay. So, work as a recovering congregation. Thank you, Susan and Sylvia, for this very in-depth report. Did a lot of work interviewing people, talking to people, looking through the archives, doing a deep, deep, deep dive into the archives. Now, one of the things that we became aware of in this process is that there are also experiences of misconduct that people have had, but because they weren't adjudicated, we couldn't name them. But they existed. They existed. So it was a challenge, I know, for them to try to find a way to put that in the report without, engaging in a lawsuit. So, but I know those experiences were had by a number of people. So it's important for that to be named. But what I really appreciate about the report is that what they talk about is the culture of the congregation. Because I think I've talked about this as a system, as a congregational system, the system is almost always more powerful than the individuals who make it up. And when that system starts to assert itself, and systems want to stay the same. That's the goal of a system, is to homeostasis, stay the same. And when that system starts to shift, then sometimes there's a lot of anxiety that gets provoked. So finding ways to shift those cultural patterns can, in and of themselves, create some anxiety. And it means we all have to kind of hold steady in the way that I talked about this morning, so that we can tolerate the distress of changing those systems. But the first step is to be aware of them, right? Anything y'all want to add about that? Yeah. Susan, yeah. Coming up.
This is oversharing, I'll admit that. But the two sources of information that helped me in my part of writing that was Hotchkiss. Not just Hotchkiss, but the UU University governance. And then the other stuff was the adaptive leadership training that I got in the UUA over the years. And you use adaptive language a lot, but I think that's another learning or workshop process that would be useful for people. You know, adaptive sounds like a nice general word,
Right.
but there's a lot more little
Right.
pieces that go with it that are very useful.
Yeah, I'm definitely planning on doing a workshop on that in the fall. Yeah.
Two things. One about the governance. Part of my new job is actually to help create a brand new governance system where I'm going. So related to dynamic governance. And there are a lot of congregations doing this work, so I wonder about the idea of having some congregations that are trying to be innovative come together for a conference or something and talk to each other online. So that's a possibility. The other thing I want to say, in addition to the kind of understanding the systemic, what happens, we want to stay in homeostasis model, is there's another layer. When there's been misconduct, particularly if you can't talk about it or if it's going to re-traumatize folks, it creates a trauma response in the community. And so you're not just dealing with the normal anxiety of change, you're also dealing with this added level of amygdala response. It's literally a biological thing that happens, where folks get reactive. And I don't know about you. You ever have a moment where you're like, why am I being so weird about this? And you're like, my thoughtful brain would not do this, but somehow I'm still doing it anyway. Anybody have that experience? That's the kind of experience we're talking about. And it's literally the brain cuts off our capacity to be thoughtful. It literally like short circuits, and we can't access our prefrontal cortex, right? So it's nothing wrong with you. And it's nothing against reason, it's just a way we work biologically. And so when we talk about these difficult things that have happened, and you're noticing that kind of reactivity, you remember Sam Wilson saying, be gentle with each other, and particularly be gentle with yourself? It's the same thing here. Be gentle with each other, and be gentle with yourself. And one of the nice things about taking some years for this developmental ministry is it lets you do that over time, because it's not something that happens quickly. You can't heal trauma in a second. So know that a part of that anxiety response is also the holding, the distress, letting that be real, but not letting it define how you go forward. Does that make sense? Any questions on that before I step back down? Can we give a hand to
There we go.
Christine for running around?
Yes. All right.
I know she loves that kind of attention, but
I don't know if this helps, but an analogy I've got to where we are and why we're looking at a 3 to 5 to 7 year time frame, take it to an individual level of you're in counseling for some mental health issue, depression, whatever, and you're not cured after your first or your second session. It may need to go on for years.
Right.
And as you make progress, you may move from a weekly visit to a biweekly visit to a monthly visit. And you may need to check in periodically for a decade or more.
Oh, yeah.
So, I think, that's how I see an analogy. We are in therapy.
Absolutely. And to amplify that a little bit, right? Like if it's true, if that's true for an individual, then how much longer does it take for a whole community of people? And you're a community of what? 500? 550? Hey, right? The other thing that we know, congregations do recover. They do. And like you said, you have to do checkups. This is a decades-long process where like the first 10 years, you're going to be like monthly or whatever, but you do need to like institutionalize checking in. How are we doing on this on a continual basis so that you don't go back to old behaviors? So thank you for that. I think that's a great analogy. All right, I'm going to step back down.
Oh, all right, Glenn.
Well, you brought him up. Bill Bridges had an analogy to Moses. They had to let go, the Hebrews, of what it meant to be a slave. It took 40 years. We're not going to take 40. But he had a promised land. So as we do this work, we've got to be pretty explicit. By the way, he didn't go along. He didn't make it to the promised
He
land.
didn't make it, yeah. Right, and that's hard to define when you're in the first 5 years. So, yeah. And also, I just want to emphasize something that Reverend Sunshine said. That we're never going to get it totally perfect. We're never going to be done. When I leave and you have a new minister, the work will still continue. It won't be, but hopefully with a lot more self-awareness and a lot more ability to manage challenges that come up. One of the things that I've been doing this year is going around doing workshops in other congregations and preaching. And one of the stories I tell in that, I think I might have told you in the fall, is a church that I visited first when I first became district executive in the Mass Bay district. And it was, I got a call from the minister saying, "You have to help because I have people standing at the door on Sunday morning saying, 'Welcome to our church, we hate our minister.'" True story. And what is it now, 19 years later, they had the same minister they called after they worked through their stuff. And it's a very healthy congregation now. It took them a while, but they are very stable now and have been doing really great work in the community. So it is possible, in fact, almost always happens, almost always. So other things, and we do have some future steps in here that we're looking at. The governance process is definitely one of them. Conducting a history workshop. One of the things that's challenging about doing that with 550 people is that the way that usually works is I stand up there and make notes on a flip chart with people calling out their experiences. Well, that would take us maybe a week. So we're coming up with a sort of hybrid process in which we'll try to do that in a way that will involve people and when other people can learn from what is said without it having to be just a unidirectional way. We want to deepen our process of telling stories. I think that's going to be the thing that's going to really advance our healing is when we get to know each other at a deeper level and a personal level and really know that we're connected even though we might be different from one another. And there's an exercise that's called asset mapping. Has anybody ever done asset mapping? Where you do a process of recognizing what are the assets we have among us, what are the assets we have in the community, and how do those match? So it's a process that I've been taught through the work I do with the Interim Ministers Network, and I think it could help us unlock a little bit by showing that we have a lot of potential. We have a lot of potential. And the work is not just among us, it's also about what we do out in the world. So that's another process that I'm hoping we can engage in next year. Questions about that? Okay. So we need you, we need all of you. When I said this during our service together, I said, we need you to show up. Somebody said to me, we show up for each other all over the place, and I should have acknowledged that, and I now acknowledge that you show up for each other in really incredible ways. And there are some of you who haven't maybe found a place to show up, you haven't found a way to connect. I'm happy to have a conversation with you about what ways in which you can connect. Any of the staff are. So we're always happy to have you participate in whatever way you would like to. And I will be a broken record. We need you to turn in your pledge forms. Really need you to turn in your pledge forms because we're looking at a big deficit right now. And we really need to pay our staff more fairly, especially given all that they have been through. So, other final questions? Oops, Sunshine has something else to say.
So one of the things I know about congregations that go through difficult times is sometimes it's hard to find the joy. I know you do, I know there was an auction dinner, there's things that you do that you have fun. But when you're working on hard things, it's really easy to stay focused on what's gone wrong, or to distrust that if you give a compliment, that somehow that negates the thing you're upset about. And so we've given a lot of applause to the staff and to the board. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to give some gratitude and some love to Rev Terasa for the work that she's done this year.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. The work continues, and it will continue, all of us doing it together. I'm happy to have any conversations later with any of y'all. If you want to send me an email, set up a time, give me a call. We can continue to talk, and we will continue to talk because we haven't finished yet. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your attention.
Race to allies and friends, lunch today. We're going to meet in Beach Hall in about 10 minutes. So